Look at you.
How are you doing?
Look at that compound for the multi-Juno award-winning producer and CEO, Kris St. Look at that compound.
How are you doing?
Where are you located right now, Kris?
I'm actually in East Tennessee right now.
Okay.
Yeah. And sorry, just trying to get over to my microphone. Let's make sure it's all plugged in correctly here. That's weird. Just give me one sec. I'll turn it on again. Yeah, I'm in basically East Tennessee, out near Knoxville. And
Okay.
so I can tell you the whole story of how we ended up here, but yeah, it's I go
Yeah,
back and forth to Los Angeles and everything like
that's where
that.
your studio is. Yeah. And for my audience, just to give you a quick introduction, Kris has recorded, with such artists like Kris Kristofferson and Garth Hudson of the band, Blue Rodeo, Ron Sexsmith, and also the founder of Sundown Session Studios and founder and CEO of one of the most successful independent music business education platforms, Sync Songwriter. So welcome, Kris.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I started out let me see, producing records, I guess, a long time ago now. But I'm so much concentrating now so much on getting independent songwriters into TV and film. That's kind of the big thing. So
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get to that, Kris. But like, first of all, let me just start with your prior life, if you will, for a second. Kris Kristofferson, rest in peace. What are the memories of recording with someone like him?
yeah, so it's interesting. He was an amazing man. I've worked with a lot of very, not a lot of, I've worked with some famous people and been able to hang around just people, I've met Brian Wilson and hung out with Willie Dixon and met Sheryl Crow. And I've met a lot of different people, some of them briefly, some for long periods of time. And Kris was top shelf. And I remember one time when he walked into the studio, we were recording this project and he got behind the microphone. It was just going to be him and his guitar for the song. And he looked over at me and he said, are you going to plug my guitar in? Like put a DI input into it, which is basically just means that you can record a guitar with a microphone or you can record it direct. When you go see a live band, often they have a direct input. So they plug their guitar in, they can move around all over the place. Doesn't sound as good as a microphone, but it works well live. In the studio, usually use a fancy mic and get a really nice, studio sound. So he said, are you going to plug my guitar in? And I said, well, I wasn't planning on it. I was hoping you'd just, stand in front of the mic here and play your thing. And he looked at me and he smiled. And he said, I suggest you plug my guitar in too. I was like, okay. So I went over and I hooked it up and set the DI and plugged him in like he was going to do a show or something. And I was like, okay, it doesn't sound quite as good, but I'll record both. So, there's that. And then he got into it. And sure enough, he was moving all over the place, right into his song, and he wasn't even paying attention to the microphone. And it was like, thank God I had the DI input because
Yeah.
that ended up on the record. And but he was, yeah,
Amazing.
such a cool guy.
Isn't it amazing, Kris? And same thing happens to me when they say never meet your heroes, right? But you meet sometimes these icons. Like last year, I got the chance to finally meet Dolly Parton during the CMAs, and she is as sweet as people say it is. She is like she's not an exaggeration. She's an angel, and it's almost like a relief. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What's interesting about that is that my experience, having worked with people at different levels, from very, very indie people all the way up to sort of the top, is that the people at the very top, and I don't just mean the artists, I'm also talking about label people or industry people or things like that. M- Almost all of them, I can't think of one example that deviates from this. Almost
Mm.
all of them have been really, really cool, you
Yeah.
know? And when I start thinking about, sort of the wealthiest people, Richard Branson and Warren Buffett and all these other people, you hear nothing but really good things about them. And so, there can be exceptions and all that to the rule, certainly. But I always found it was the tier underneath that was more problematic generally. Now, I'm really generalizing here, okay? But
Yes.
the most problems that I ran into in the studio or with my career or whatever wasn't the top with the top people. It was always the people that were just sort of underneath that. And I found that really interesting. And I'm not sure to this day whether that means that people, if they're good people, they tend to, because we all have to work with other people, right?
Yeah.
So to get to the top, Is it that if you're a good person, you get to the top, but you also have to be talented. So it sort of makes me think it's a combination of those two things, being able to work with people and understanding and being humble and, giving credit where it's due and taking compliments graciously, as well as having this incredible bright light, this incredible talent. And so I always find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, excellent point. And we'll pivot here to your projects in a second. But to add to that, Kris, I totally agree. And my theory is, the industry, as you know, it's ups and downs. Like
Yeah.
especially for like these people that have been there for decades. Like they're not playing the Super Bowl every year. And the people that have lasted as long as the Kristoffersons or all these icons that that you've worked with, they've seen it all. And I think that they know that how you treat people on the way, up is the same on the way down. To your point. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, Kris, thanks for that. You're a pro, so I have to ask you about this. I mean, the landscape of the recording studios in 2025 now. Wanted to ask you about that because it's fascinating to me. Because on one side, and you can, I'm not a producer, so you can answer this for me. On one side, I feel like music tools are more available than ever to everyone. It like democratized the process for like everyone. But on the other side, I feel like, having the right session players, the right experience, that matters more than ever, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I can draw on my sort of experience. I'm not in the studio as much as I used to be, sort of twirling the knobs and getting the sounds and doing all that. My main focus has been helping people get their music into TV and film and then helping them produce that, sort of I have a remote studio and I have a team and all of that, that's sort of currently when we're talking 2024, 2025 here. But to your point, in the 20 plus years that I've been producing records, I had the good fortune of winning some awards and all that, doing that. That wasn't those, I'm saying that to point out that I didn't use all this sort of fancy trickery stuff. It wasn't, I didn't sort of, I didn't get an award because I had the coolest recording chain with the latest plugins, I got it because of applying fundamental things that I learned, and music can be a little bit different. I'll put it in a different way. So I had a friend who is an award-winning producer who shall remain nameless for this example. And I went into his studio in Hollywood and he was recording some fairly famous person and he had a mix up. He was mixing at that point. And I walked in just to say, hey, hang out while he's doing his mix by himself. And he was like, hey, man, you know what? I'm kind of hung up on these background vocals. They're just not gelling for me, I'm not sure what's going on here, but it happens to the best of us, right? So he said, I'm going to go for lunch. If you want to save a session, feel free to like see if you have any ideas, So I said, sure. So out the door he walked and I sat down in his chair. And first thing I did is I looked at the session and I saw all of these, plugins on there, big chains of plugins and buses going everywhere to different auxes and all these effects and all of that. So for people who are listening who aren't really familiar with studio stuff, it's really, he had a very complicated sort of setup in terms of how he was processing the background vocals. And so the first thing I did, of course, save the session so I didn't ruin what he was doing, created a brand new one with his settings. And then I started bypassing all of the effects, all of the different plugins and all these fancy things that he had all lined up. And behind, like the Wizard of Oz, in behind there were these beautiful vocals. Really talented background vocalists. And I was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. So I started to reapply what he was doing and then, would leave some bypassed and would adjust some things. And when he came back and listened to it, I had probably 25% of the processing on there, but was really relying on the fundamentals and relying kind of what you were alluding to the talent of the actual singers. Now, my friend is extremely talented. He's very knowledgeable. He's very good at what he does. We all sometimes lose track, though. We get caught. We're all guilty of that. When we think of something too much in our lives, we overthink it. We get stressed out, sometimes by taking some time away or, sleeping on it. And our brain somehow has this latent processing power, that processes this for us. And then we wake up and we're like, oh, it's so obvious to me, So it was obvious to me because I was fresh ears. I walked in off the street and I was able to kind of look through the challenge that he was sort of lost in like a fog, And it really came down to that fundamental. And I've always stuck with that first, it's always sort of first principle thinking about like, I don't have to do things the way everybody else does it. Where is the actual talent here? Where is the juice? Where is the thing that is going to make this work? And it comes from simplicity, often.
Simplicity. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said there, Kris. Kris, you're Canadian, right? Of course.
Yeah, originally I'm both. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
U.S. citizen now, but I was born in yeah, dual citizen.
I love it. You're a multiple Juno Award winner, which is like the Grammys in Canada. I wanted to ask you this, Kris. You're the perfect person to ask this because there's such great talent coming out of Canada. I mean, we have some great friends of our show that have crossed over, like Wild Rivers or something like that. Um, but there's others like Tate McRae, which are great, or Tia Wood, that are really good Canadian talents that are, up the charts over there, north of the border, and they don't seem to make that breakthrough to America. And I don't know why it is, because when you hear it, they got the production, they got the songwriting, they got the talent, the charisma. You're the perfect person. You're a dual citizen, Kris, and you're very accomplished in both of our countries. Why do you think that is? That some make the breakthrough and some don't?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have actually pondered this, and I've sort of, over the years watched the same thing you were just talking about. And my sort of theory, I think, has got sort of three parts to it. The first is, let's talk about Canadians. They do punch above their weight. In terms of population, Canada punches way above its weight in terms of the number of, people, stars, that make it, going all the way back, well, not all the way, but, Neil Young, came down in the 60s, and then, there's Avril Lavigne and Celine Dion. And I mean, the list goes on, Bieber, and, just an incredible number of people. And so much of that had to do, I think, with sort of three things. One is, two are positive and one is sort of a weird negative, I think. So one of them is Canada has more of a support structure for artists than they do in the US. Now, the argument can be made that when you're really hungry, you're really going to try, and you're going to really try, and it's going to push you. In the US, there's a lot less safety nets, for most things. And so on, you got to cut your own road, and it's about coming to a place to make something of yourself, but it's also really rough on the people who don't have the means, they could get there, but they don't have that. Canada has a lot of, grants and little artist loans that you can get that really you don't have to pay back for like 30 years or whatever. Typically, if you default on it, it's not going to be like you're going to, they're going to put you in jail or anything. But there's just this support. I think that is really, really helpful for Canadian artists. The second, which is the same as the first almost, is that Canada has a very large middle class. They have fewer rich and fewer poor than the US. And they have a very, very broad middle class. So there's a bunch of kids, that are being brought up in this sort of infrastructure where they've got that support, again, family support, where the parents, I mean, when I had a band, my parents had bought us our first van, and you just don't get that as much in the US. You gotta like just really scramble to do things. So I think that's really helped Canadians as well, And the third thing, which is kind of a bit of a negative, is that, and it actually works against Canadians, is that although the labels, you can pick a label, I won't name any just in case, but
Sure.
Major labels have subsidiaries all over the world, right? In Europe and France and like in all the European countries, and they've got them in Canada and different places, Japan and all that. So in Canada, the major labels have major label subsidiaries in Canada. So there's a staff there, and there's people who are Canadians who go into the office and they work for the major labels in Canada. When they sign someone in Canada, the deal most often says worldwide representation, which, supposedly if you're signed by a major label in Canada, it means your record will be distributed around the world. It doesn't work that way. Always, mostly. Really what happens is that the people who get signed in those countries, they sort of get relegated to those countries for a little while. So if you get signed to a major label in the US, or you sign to the same label subsidiary in Canada, they don't often share each other's stuff. Like the US one's more interested in pushing their artists that they signed, even though it's the same label. They're kind of two separate businesses in a way. So certainly seen that where there's not a lot of, it's not as uniform as you'd like to think. Now, I'm painting a big broad brush. There's some major labels that are very inclusive, very, they treat all their international stars the same way they do their domestic ones. But there was that trend anyway. When I was up in Canada, there was that thing. If you sign in Canada, you were generally promoted in Canada. It was difficult through the label to make it in the US.
Fascinating. Wow. Such great insight there, Kris. Thanks for that. God, man, I could talk to you for 17 hours. But let me talk about Sync Songwriter because I mean, what a fascinating kind of like business education project that you launched here. I mean, a lot of your alumni have won like, like the Palme d'Or at Cannes. Like you are really like making like a mark in what is such an important thing now, like syncing. When did you fall in love with this? Because I feel like I don't know. I feel like was this a thing before the streaming era? Like I just feel like the importance it just came to fruition like 10 years ago, at least to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny. You should, I'll start with the history and then maybe about my falling in love with it part, which is I didn't actually fall in love with it and I'm still not in love with it. I like it a lot, but there's something else I'm in love with about Sync. So the history of it is really what happened is that way back when, 25 years ago, not so way back when for some of us, they had like cable TV and stuff, right? I mean, it was cable. And then a lot of the shows were produced for cable. And there wasn't a lot of stuff that was like where musicians would look and say, wow, that's cool. I want to be on that show. They're like, it wasn't cool to be on TV. It really wasn't. Indie musicians did not want to do that. And so as you pointed out, as streaming started to happen, but even a little bit before that, as more and more channels started to come up, right, that weren't your typical big broadcasters, they started producing different kinds of shows, different kinds of things. Movies started to become a different industry where they weren't just in the theaters anymore. You could go into like Blockbuster, and rent a VHS and put it in your machine. And there's this whole rental thing that was going on. So there were a lot of movies that started to go straight to, video, right? So there were a lot more things that were going on and it wasn't as restricted as it used to be. So around that time, this guy, Moby, which I'm sure you've heard of, he was already well known for a few hits that he had. He, a music supervisor, quite famous in the music supervision world. And for those who don't know what a music supervisor is, they're the people who are hired by the movie studios and the TV studios to get music into the shows, movies, and the ads. So the directors and the producers are so busy on the visuals and the script and the casting, they don't have time to look for the music, right, for the movies and the shows. So they hire music supervisors. They're people who are good at music. Like they're either musicians themselves, just love music, just know what works in a show, know what works in a scene. And so they hire them and the supervisors go out and they find music for the show. So basically what happened is famous supervisor came over from England with Moby and came to LA. And I know him and I talked to him about this whole story. And he started really shopping Moby heavily to TV and film. And he did incredibly well on that record Play. And it got synced like crazy. I mean, it was all over every show almost, it seemed like. And that was really the thing that broke open the gates, the floodgates for indie musicians to be able to start thinking, hey, this is cool. Hey, I can make money at this. Because when you get your music in a TV show or ad or whatever movie, you get what's called a sync fee up front. And that is often in the thousands of dollars. It can go anywhere from $500 for reality TV, all the way into six figures, right? If you're, the Rolling Stones or whoever, they're getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to use their song once, often. And it's all negotiated. There's no hard figures on this. So as an indie musician, you can make a lot of money because the TV studios and movie studios, they don't want to pay the major labels for these famous artists, right? They're looking like, I think Mad Men used a song, Tomorrow Never Knows, I think, in around 2012. And the figure I remember that they paid, I'm not positive, but the figure I remember they paid was $250,000 for that song.
Wow.
And that's one episode, one sync placement. So you got to very deep pockets to get those kind of songs. And they all have a budget, a yearly budget, right? Over the year and the annual budget. So they can say, the studio starts saying, man, you know what? I can pay these indie songwriters, a fraction of that. But
Sure.
the indie songwriter might make like 20 grand, and the indie songwriter's like, oh, this is awesome. I'll take it, so it's a win-win essentially. So, that is when, to answer your question about like, that's
Yeah,
when
no, that's
the
great.
industry grew and changed. How I fell in love with an aspect of sync licensing wasn't the actual, I never wanted to be a music supervisor. I think it's a cool job. And I think it's neat what they do. It wasn't really my calling. That's all. I have a lot of friends who are music supervisors. The thing I loved about it was because for a lot of my career, I served indie musicians. I used to be in the studio working with indie musicians and working with majors. And the good indie musicians used to have music that was just as good as the majors. Those artists had music that was just as good, but they didn't have the managers, the labels, or the agents propelling their career along. So inevitably what would happen is we would work super hard on a record. It would go out into the ether to crickets. Nothing would happen, and it got frustrating. It was like, well, how can we get exposure to these really great indie artists, their music? Sync licensing. Because not only the money, I talked about the money already, the other part, the part I'm in love with, is the exposure. So when you get a song on a major thing, like I worked with a musician, just talking to him last week, he's gotten 3 tracks into Grey's Anatomy, you can imagine the exposure his music is getting. The viewership, right, is in the millions for big shows,
Actually, for these big scenes that are anchoring emotionally to people. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so people are there and going like, what? Who is this? This is such a cool song. They're Shazamming it. They're typing it into search engines, trying to figure out who this artist is, get massive bumps in their plays, in their Spotify spins. There's one who got into the movie Pain Hustler, and they got written up in Billboard magazine. They had festivals calling them. There's all kinds of stuff happened from one good sync placement. That's the part I'm in love with sync licensing.
Amazing. Amazing, Kris. My God. Look, we run out of time, but you're going to have to come back. If you don't mind coming back next year, we would love to just talk about all the music industry things, because you are the voice of reason for everything that's going on under the hood of this crazy music world we live in.
Amazing. I really appreciate that, Jamie. And just, one last thing is that
Absolutely.
if people are out there and interested in, getting their music into TV and film, every January 12th this year, I have at Sync Songwriter, we do the Sync Songwriter Music Supervisor panel. So people can come out totally free. You don't have to travel. It's all online. It's virtual. And so just go to the site, syncsongwriter.com, grab a spot for the panel, or just reach out to us. And we have typically over 10,000 musicians show up for this panel, and you'll learn everything you need to know and about how to start making connections in the TV and film industry.
Yeah. And I get that question so much. So that is super helpful from all the artists here in Nashville. We'll put the links in the bio here and all the description below. Kris SD, thank you so much. Very enlightening chat. Really appreciate your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Jamie.
Bye.
Bye. Parliament.
Thank you for tuning in. Click here to subscribe and get the latest from the show, including exclusive behind-the-scenes footage and once-in-a-lifetime performances. And as always, thank you for making J-Rock Concerts Media part of your day.